Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 5 most surprising cards from the Witchwood. And when I say surprising, I mean these are cards that the community didn't expect to be very good, or very powerful, or very influential, but in fact have carved out spots for themselves in the early Witchwood meta, and it looks like these cards are in fact actually rather strong. So they far exceeded our expectations. They were essentially underrated cards coming into the expansion release. Now, I should say this is not based on my personal ratings, although I am going to include those for curiosity's sake, but I went through and I looked at the Vicious Syndicate pre-release poll and sorted all the cards by their ratings from 1 to 5 stars, essentially took the ones at the bottom of the list and took the 5 with the lowest scores that are seeing play today. So this is not just some random collection of cards I happened to identify or thought were underrated. I actually used some real data to determine the cards that were included on this list, and sure, there might be a few extras, but these were the 5 most underrated as far as I could determine based on the numbers I had. All of that said, let's just go ahead and talk about these cards. Up first here is Scaleworm, which the community rated at a 2.3, which will be the highest score on this list. Will actually descend towards, I guess, what you'd call the most underrated card. I also personally gave this card 2 stars, so me and the community were pretty nearly in line here, because of course these are averages, so I can't give a card 2.5 stars, for instance, whereas the community can average into that amount. So we're very, very closely connected there. And Scaleworm obviously is seeing some play. This has become the Tar Creeper sweeper, as I've said 1,000 times, of the expansion thus far. Tar Creeper on 3, Scaleworm is often the perfect answer on turn 4. Of course, that only works in Dragon decks because this is a Dragon synergy card, but Priest in particular is really, really good at running Dragons, especially in a Spiteful Summoner archetype, and Spiteful Priest is one of the better decks in the meta still to this day, so Scaleworm fits in perfectly as a mid-range minion that gives you a way to address the board immediately, which often Spiteful decks can lack because they don't have cheap spells to serve as removal or board swings. So between Scaleworm and Duskbreaker, Priest basically has 2 great turn 4 answers to help them keep the board a little bit in check, swing things back in their favor, leading into those, turn 5 coin Spiteful Summoners, or at least helping keep things in check moving into a turn 6 Spiteful Summoner. So Scaleworm is really quite perfect in those environments. This has also been thrown into a handful of other decks, including a Dragon build of Spiteful Druid. Most of those have lost their popularity, but clearly Scaleworm, just because of its ability to take such favorable trades instantly and immediately impact the board due to the fact that it has Rush, and it's just absolute insane trade value into Tar Creeper, which is one of the most common cards in the game, if not actually the most common card in the game right now, I believe. So those things combined, Scaleworm turned out to be a really strong card. Is it the best card in the game? By no means, no, but it's certainly playable, and it feels really good in this meta in particular, so it vastly exceeded our expectations. I think in reality I would call this a 4-star card at this point, so we were quite a bit off. So moving on to the next spot here, we have Druid of the Scythe, and honestly, this is basically exactly like our previous card in a lot of ways. The community gave it 2.2 stars instead of 2.3. I gave this one 2 stars, and once again, it is a rush card that is specifically really only seeing play in Spiteful Summoner decks, because once again, it really helps to have cards that can immediately address the board when you're short on spells, as Spiteful Summoner Druid is. So Druid of the Scythe is a central piece of Spiteful Summoner, allowing them to kill some really threatening stuff immediately, keeping them alive into their swing turn, keeping them at least reasonably matched on the board so that Spiteful Summoner actually makes an impact as opposed to just playing it into a giant board of stuff that instantly kills you. So much like Scaleworm gives you that pseudo spell in a minion, Druid of the Scythe is exactly the same. It's a 4-mana damage spell most of the time. Of course, the flexibility here, where you can sometimes give it Taunt, also helps if you happen to be ahead in Spiteful Druid, which can certainly help, can certainly happen from time to time if you get that Firefly Kelliseth start. A 2/4 proactive Taunt is still sometimes valuable. It's not just a reactive card. So that slight boost in flexibility certainly helps Druid of the Scythe more than I expected it to as well. So yes, even though when you look at this, and from a stat standpoint, it doesn't look that strong in either direction. Neither a 4-2 rush or a 2-4 taunt seem amazing on their own, particularly in that context where you need minions that contribute to the board. This is a great fit for the deck. Now, would Druid of the Scythe be played without a Spiteful Summoner Druid deck? I don't think so. Not necessarily, at least not based on what we've seen so far. So I do think this one is a bit intrinsically tied to the success of Spiteful Summoner as a card and as an archetype for Druid. So this could be something that goes away in the future, but regardless of that, right now it's definitely good enough to make the cut, and Spiteful Summoner wasn't some huge surprise deck that came out of nowhere, so we did really miss the mark on just how good Druid of the Scythe might be. So moving on to the third card on the list, this one might be the most surprising to me. Well, perhaps number 2 actually is, but certainly Vicious Scalehide really caught me off guard. Because I gave this 2 stars, obviously, as did the community, as you can see on screen. And 2 stars to me does mean it has some very fringe playability. 1 star basically means this thing will absolutely never be played. So, I thought perhaps, once in a blue moon somebody might run Vicious Scalehide. But I couldn't have been more wrong, because in reality, a ton of decks are running Vicious Scalehide, and that is a complete surprise to me. So most notably, I think you have to say Even Paladin often runs Vicious Scalehide, not always, but often. And then also Quest Rogue. That was the big surprise, I guess. Quest Rogue has really taken to finding success with Vicious Scalehide because, of course, when this becomes a 5/5 with Rush and Lifesteal, that is an incredibly useful tool to Quest Rogue because it clears minions on the opponent's side of the board, it heals them up for a ton of health, and it's still just a giant body for only 2 mana, all of which makes it perfect for the deck. And frankly, I think, is one of the reasons Quest Rogue is able to find success today, because in some matchups, this card alone creates such enormous onboard swings. Killing stuff, healing up, buying time for the rest of the powerful Quest Rogue stuff to hit the board and kill the opponent with all the 5 damage chargers, etc. But without Vicious Scalehide, sometimes you would just outright lose games. So in many ways, Vicious Scalehide is a perfect interaction with Quest Rogue, but frankly still good outside of that as well, especially in a Paladin meta where there's a lot of 1/1s running around. Vicious Scalehide essentially takes nice trades into 1/1s. It does so instantly, and also has a little bit of life gain too, so there's a nice little bonus there. So even Paladin, even Shaman has even managed to make Vicious Scalehide a thing, and of course Quest Rogue all running this. I've even seen it in like some Hunter lists as well because it does have some Beast synergies. So in reality, Vicious Scalehide, an incredibly flexible card, many different classes are using. Turns out just having all these comboed keywords together means it can do a lot of different things, and that was much better than any of us seemingly expected. So moving on to the second one, I guess this is actually the most surprising card to me, because I gave Cinderstorm 1 star. And if I'm being totally truthful with you, I still sort of feel like Cinderstorm isn't all that amazing. I still think it's like a 2 or 3 star card, but in reality, it's seeing a lot of play. People actually like Cinderstorm quite a bit. But that said, the community missed really hard on this one too. They gave this a 1.7, which means a vast majority of people thought it was a 1 or 2 star card, and frankly, the community's 2 star ratings are really, really low. Most people rate things pretty generously, so when something gets 2 stars, that is like an utter failure to most people who rate cards. So the fact that it came in under 2 means people thought this was remarkably bad. They really trashed on Cinderstorm, and so did I. But it turns out, of course, Tempo Mage is finding some success running Cinderstorm. It does turn out it is indeed face damage sometimes in a deck that's looking for aggression and looking for burst damage, but it's also really good at, once again, killing 1/1s. It's a great answer to the Paladin meta that we are in right now. That said, I have a feeling that as the meta shifts, as additional cards come out, as things move around, I think Cinderstorm will fall out of favor in aggressive mage decks. That is, if aggressive mage decks even survive in the first place, I don't think Cinderstorm is going to make the cut too much longer. Just because simply I think there are going to be better options. The way this can kind of backfire and sometimes kill minions when you need face damage, or sometimes hit the face when you need to kill minions, the fact that it is so random and there's not that much raw damage bundled into it. I mean, if you compare this from an efficiency standpoint to something like Arcane Missiles, obviously 2 mana for only 2 additional random pings, that's not a very efficient, favorable comparison. Now, some people might say, well, you could compare it to Avenging Wrath, a playable card, and it's half the cost with only a few less pings. And yes, that's true, but that's a different class, and often Avenging Wrath is utilized in a different fashion. So I don't know that that's quite as direct a comparison. But regardless, when I reviewed this, I did take those 2 comparisons, and I said it falls in the middle. Neither of those cards are particularly amazing. Now, it does turn out Avenging Wrath has started seeing play also in this meta, perhaps not by accident. Once again, there are a lot of 1/1s. So Cinderstorm somehow is playable and much better than I expected, certainly better than the community expected as well. We all got this one wrong. Will we always be wrong? Not necessarily, but that doesn't matter. We were wrong. We have to judge the card at any given time, and right now it's playable. People like to run it. It is good. So even though I still personally have my doubts, this is somewhat undoubtedly an underrated card. And then finally here, I guess we have what you'd call the most surprising card of all, because this one got the very worst ratings of all playable cards in the Witchwood. Now, there were lower rated cards, but none that are seeing any sort of substantial amount of play. But Wormguard here, as you can see, only got 1.4 stars from the community ratings. That is just abysmal. It's actually absurd to see a card get that low of rating, because that means more people on average thought it was a 1-star card as opposed to a 2 or higher star card. And I'm sure there were some loonies out there who gave it 5 stars, ended up being more correct than any of us, which brought up the average. So essentially a vast majority of people thought this thing was 1 star. And remember, 1 star is the lowest. You couldn't give things 0 stars. So people were really, really down on Wormguard. And in fact, even more down on it than I was. I gave this thing 2 stars. I thought it had some fringe playability potential. That's very rare, by the way, that I rate a card higher than the community average. Usually I come in a little lower because I think my scale is a tad different than most people's, and my expectations are a little bit different. And nonetheless, I gave this thing 2 stars, so I was marginally more right, but mostly still very wrong, because Wormguard is, in fact, a pretty solid card. Now, once again, much like our Scale Worm, this is restricted, of course, in the kinds and numbers of decks that are able to run it, because it is a Dragon Synergy card. But nonetheless, once again, this is a thing we've seen popping up in Spiteful Priest decks fairly often, because it just gives them a great follow-up to that turn 6 Spiteful Summoner. You can play a giant taunt afterwards and protect whatever minion you summon to just continue to load up the board with giant health totals that are incredibly hard to deal with. Most decks just start to run out of answers to all these enormous things, so Wormguard, it turns out, works out really nicely as a follow-up piece and just applying more and more pressure. Obviously a great defensive card sometimes too. If you happen to fall behind against an aggressive deck, they have to push through this giant taunt wall. And I think Wormguard, frankly, has a chance to get even better in the meta as more and more dragons are introduced throughout this standard format rotation. There will be more dragons in the pool every time we move forward, assuming any dragons at all get released, which is almost certainly going to be the case. So a card that might even improve over time and is already solidly playable. Most of us just missed this one because Wormguard's actually really nice. And I don't even know why we missed it so hard. I'm not sure why this one got so underrated. It looks okay. It's just a big taunt. It's sort of a pseudo Ancient of War, a card that has been played in the past in competitive constructed Hearthstone, and it's a neutral Ancient of War. So why not? I don't really know why we were so down on this one. I think I should have given this card 3 stars, and it's really probably a 3 to 4 star card at the end of the day in my mind. But for some reason, we all hated Wormguard, and it turns out, in fact, it surprised us all. So there you go, the 5 most surprising cards from the Witchwood. I do think there was a bit of a theme there. Most of the cards on this list are good specifically because of Spiteful Summoner decks. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean we underrated the influence of Spiteful Summoner decks in the new meta? Perhaps. Maybe we didn't see the need for some of these cards and the need for replacements for spells in Spiteful Summoner decks, so we didn't realize that Rush was going to make that big of an impact because, a handful of the cards in this list were Rush cards. 3 were Rush cards. Wormguard didn't necessarily feel like a spiteful card to me, but nonetheless, that's where it has found success as well. So, in some ways, it's weird. This list almost seemed like seemed to capture the fact that Spiteful Summoner decks were so darn good in this meta, or at least that these cards somehow worked out really nicely. Cinderstorm still completely blows my mind. I don't totally understand that one to this day, but I'm going to keep watching the card and watching the numbers because I guess it is actually better, and I just can't believe it. Now, of course, I know there are people out there who rated these cards 5 stars and told us they were going to be amazing and had the exact deck list that they were going to be in perfectly well defined before the expansion was released. And that's cool. Grats. Share that in the comments. I'm not totally sure I'll believe you, but why not? It's very possible you got these right and you didn't underrate these and you weren't at all surprised. That's cool to brag. I don't mind if you brag in the comments at all. On the other hand, if there were other cards that have surprised you that you thought were terrible, feel free to share those as well. And if you were gloriously, unbelievably wrong, like myself and the rest of the community, and you want to share in just how wrong you were, feel free to leave that in the comments below too. But until then, everybody, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.